Now I'll just invite you to put your speaker on, or put your view on speaker view so you can see the sermon today. Our calendar is one of many historical and cultural calendars. There have been many ways across the centuries, across the millennia, of measuring time, and those measurements, some of them have come and gone. The calendar that most of us use today is one where the new year starts on January 1st. Ours is the Gregorian calendar, adopted and promoted by Pope Gregory VIII in 1582. But the non-Catholic world didn't embrace this new calendar readily. Britain and the colonies didn't adopt it until 1752. Russia didn't adopt it until 1917. This whole time thing and calendars is a human fabrication. But even though time is a human construct, it is very useful and is a significant influence on our lives. All civilizations have realized that the present moment is just a fleeting moment between the past and the future. Now, my favorite example of this is the Roman god Janus. And Janus is often depicted as having two faces, one facing the past and the other facing the future. The one facing the past is often bearded and that of an older man, and the one facing the future is often a clean-shaven young face facing the future. Janus is the god of the beginnings and transitions, past and future, the god of passages, the god of doorways. And our month of January is named after the Roman god Janus. And January is the month of starting over once again. There's something about numbers changing that stirs hope within us. Do you remember wanting to get old enough to get your driver's license? Do you remember getting old enough to buy alcohol, old enough to vote? And we're somehow enamored with ages that are divisible by 10. People remember their lives on their birthdays of turning 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, but likely no one remembers turning 37 and a half. We are facing not only a new year, but the beginning of a new decade. And the god Janus tells us it's time not only to reflect and ponder about our past year, but also our past decade and our past lifetime. As Janus tells us, it is the time of year to look backwards. It is the time of year to look forward. I stopped making New Year's resolutions a long, long time ago. I didn't give up trying to change. I just stopped competing about it. So after much deliberation and much therapy, I stopped trying to become a better person. And I've spent the last decade or two trying to become what Carl Jung calls a whole person. For the words better person implies a comparison, a competition, an improvement of some fabricated criterion of a hierarchy. And striving to be better implies that I'm competing against myself or someone else on some scale that's tilted against anyone who plays the game. Jung believed that wholeness refers to the principle that people throughout their lives strive for harmony between the conscious and the unconscious. In other words, wholeness is becoming more aware of my unconscious thoughts and how they play a role in my life. And this includes acknowledging and learning from our shadow side. And the shadow is that unrecognized side of ourselves that we too often bury or hide. There's a sermon there, and we'll do that on another Sunday. I don't make New Year's resolutions. I do, however, reflect on the past as a new year begins. Now, if you're like me, when I look backwards, I try and be honest and objective. I try and see the good done and the mistakes I've made. I see my failures and my gains. And when I acknowledge the entirety of my last year's activities, I can learn from all of it and become a little more whole. My mistakes teach me more than my successes. Resolutions, they're about changing yourself. They're personal. Resolutions are not about social changes. Social changes are the goals and desires and dreams we work on collectively. But resolutions are about personal changes. And I believe we are only capable of changing one person, just yourself. And when we decide that we want to change ourselves, we fall into the gap between what is and what could be. Parker Palmer calls this the tragic gap, and he writes, quote, "By the tragic gap, I mean the gap between the hard realities around us and what we know is possible, not because we wish it were so, but because we've seen it so with our own eyes." Quote, a desire to change means jumping into the tension-filled gap between what is and what we know is possible, but just isn't so yet. And this tragic gap isn't closed easily. It's the most difficult work a person can take on because it means changing yourselves, either your behaviors or your attitudes or both. And I believe if you want to change the world, you start by shrinking your own tragic gap. And as the gap gets smaller, it shows. It shows to those around you and everyone you meet. When you become more whole, more congruent, people notice. And you become an example and an inspiration to others. And they see that their own tragic gap can be smaller. And as we work on ourselves collectively, we change each other and the world changes. Remember that the tragic gap is where we spend most of our lives. We live in the tragic gap between what is and what could be. To deny our own gap is naive and delusional. Seeing the gap in ourselves can create shame or inspiration. It just depends on being Janus, being in transition. It just depends on how we remember and how we act to create the future. How will 2020 be remembered? Will it be considered the tragedy of the century? Or will 2020 be remembered as the good old days? We're too close to 2020 to be objective about the long-term lasting impacts. It might have been the worst year, or it might become a transitional point from which we rebuild a more compassionate world. Collective tragedy can be a firm foundation to build upon. Collective suffering can bring people together to make social changes, like Black Lives Matter. In 2021, things may get worse, or things might get a lot better. Just look at the changes already coming and the hope coming with us. Our new Congress will be sworn in today. The electoral votes will be tallied on January 6th, bringing in a new administration. Stimulus checks are showing up. I got mine on Friday. The vaccines are being given and coming to a clinic near you. The inauguration will occur in a few weeks. The god Janus tells us that we are in a doorway. We are in a transition between 2020 and 2021. We are in between what was and what will be. My prayer for all of you is that you take this season to remember and reflect on what happened to you in 2020, and that you face the future with hope and work to shrink the tragic gap between what is and what can be. For though that is who we are as religious people, we are people who don't accept the gap. We are the people who shrink the tragic gap, not just on New Year's Day, but all days, not just now, but always. For we recognize that we are always in the transitions, and the future is ours to write. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.